Hvala sem, da ste prišli na dogodek z Frankom Rudo in Alenko Zupančič, Ukinimo, svobodo. Dogodek prirejamo ob izidu Frankove knjige s tem naslovom v odličnem prevodu Alenka Zupančiča, ki se nam je danes pridružil. Spremljam besedo Simona Hajdinja, tako da bom kar kmalu predal besedo našima gostoma. I would also like to greet people joining us live, streaming over Facebook. We will soon turn to English. This event will be in English, but I will make a few announcements in Slovenian. Rad bi samo povedal, da je danes knjiga na voljo po posebni znižani ceni z 20% popustom. Zdaj pa preden predam besedo dokončno Franku in Alenki, jo samo še nakratko predstavim. Frank Ruda je sicer trenutno šef oddelka za filozofijo na univerzi v Dundeeju, kar je na Škotskem in ne v Avstraliji, kot bi morda kdo mislil. Danes je prav iz tega Dundeeja priletel, torej najprej z avtobusom se peljal do Edinburgha in potem letel čez več krajev, da je prišel do nas. Tako da smo zelo veseli, da se nam je oglasil. V Sloveniji je dobro poznan, velikokrat je tukaj gost. Izšla je tudi že njegova knjiga Heglova drhav, ki je imela precejšen odmev, precej dober odmev, tako pri nas kot tudi v tujini. Izšla je pri založbi Sofija, če se ne motim. Sicer pa je on tudi eden od sourednikov ene od čudovitih internetnih revij. Sorry, Frank, I completely forgot. What is the title of the Crisis and Critique, of course. Ja, se pravičujem, absolutno v hipu mi je všel naslov te revije iz glave, Crisis and Critique, z Agonom Hamzo. Welcome, Frank. It's a great pleasure to have you here in Ljubljana, to have your book translated so that we can discuss things with you in Slovenian. I'll come back to your book immediately. Just before that, I want to present Alenka Zupančič. V Sloveniji sicer Alenka Zupančič seveda ni potrebno posebej predstavljati, bom pa samo omenil, da dve stvari, zaradi katerih smo jih hvaležni. No, veliko stvari je, zaradi katerih smo jih hvaležni, ampak ena je definitivno njena knjiga z naslovom What is sex? Zdi se mi, da kar naprej vsi govorijo o seksu, končno se nekdo lotil pravega vprašanja, kaj hudiča je seks. Druga stvar, zaradi katere smo jih hvaležni, je pa knjiga O koncu, ki je nedavno izšla pri založbi Društva za teoretsko psihoanalizo v zbirki Lekta. Knjiga O koncu, jaz je še nisem uspel dobiti v roke, upam, da jo bom kmalu, gotovo gre spet za eno od prelomnih del. Toliko od mene. And now I think without any further ado, I'd like to pass the word to Frank, who has come to tell us something about... There are some provocations that he has in the book in Slovenian language. If you have already seen this, maybe also in English, which strike the reader quite immediately. He has... I don't know if this was like a kind of a self-help book thing, or is this really just a provocation? But he says something like, start by expecting the worst, which seems like a reasonable motto for our life today. But he then continues, act as if you didn't exist, which I think is a much more complex thing to do. And he goes on, and he finishes with telling us that we should act as if we were an inexistent woman. Ravnaj tako, kot da si neobstoječa ženska. Which seems... Let's hear more about this. So, Frank, my challenge to you will be, please tell us, how can we make it practical? How do we practically act like an inexistent woman? Ladies and gentlemen, Frank Ruda. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Gregor. Thank you also to everyone involved in making this. I mean, this is really pretty, I find. And thank you all for coming and ruining your evening with me, and thank you especially for Alenka for having, I think, the worst job of all. But yeah, so I'm not gonna, I think we will get maybe to that question with the inexistent woman. What I want to do is to give you a bit of an idea why all these strange act as if thingies and what the project is about, by basically telling you something about the other half of a couple of which this book is a part. Precisely, this was preceded by another book. And this book is basically attempting to give a kind of, let's say, to offer conceptual tools by reconstructing bits of the history of modern rationalist philosophy. And the attempted solutions or suggestions react to a problem. And so I thought it might be interesting to hear what the problem is, because otherwise you just get the solutions and, well, solutions are great, right? But sometimes it helps to know what they're supposed to solve. Both books function in an analogous manner by discussing certain, let's say, moments from the history of modern rationalism. Descartes, Kant, Hegel are crucial for both. In this book, there is a certain, let's say, prehistory and a flirtation with Martin Luther. We can get to that if you're into Protestantism or wannabe. And the other book ends with a discussion of also Marx, whereas here there is an end, or an end after a preliminary end, made with a discussion of Freud. But to now tell you something about the problem, I want to turn to, well, one of the most scandalous of all the notebooks that have been published by Heidegger. Scandalous because in certain parts clearly fascist, or at least racist, namely the Black Notebooks that Heidegger wrote between 1942 and 48. And I just want to single out one quote from that notebook, and I think this quote has nothing particularly fascist or racist about it. And in that quote, Heidegger says that the equal, das Gleiche, and he means the equalizing, the equal, produces indifference. So in German that reads, das Gleiche bringt das Gleichgültige hervor. So Heidegger argues and believes, and you will immediately see why I'm telling you that, hopefully, that indifference is the problem of Western thought. And it has something to do with stuff having the gleiche Gültigkeit, the equal validity, the equal significance maybe even, and thereby becoming indifferent. Gleichgültig. So the famous, as you may know or may have heard, or someone maybe told you, or there are rumors, the main indifference that Heidegger is concerned with is the forgetting of a difference between the ontic sphere, so the sphere of beings, and the ontological sphere, so the sphere of being. Whatever that means, for Heidegger that is a kind of constitutive distinction, a fundamental distinction that is forgotten and that has quite catastrophic effects afterwards. So Heidegger, for example, refers to the forgetting of this particular difference in a seminar from, so pre-racist, if there were any, Heidegger from 1929 and 30, on the fundamental concepts of metaphysics as the deepest indifference everyone could experience, and that concerns basically all spheres of the human life. So the forgetting of this constitutive difference is really a problem that concerns mankind. And this is not only a diagnosis that Heidegger articulated, but you find as different thinkers like as Leszek Kolakowski, who talked about the spread of indifference in European civilization from the 16th century, or Alain Badiou, who talked of a planetary indifference that we're living through, and that is significant, a symptom of the ways in which we're living. So why am I telling you that? Because indifference is the first name of the problem to which abolishing freedom, and what abolishing freedom deals with, is attempting to gather elements of an answer. That this is not only, let's say, something that Heidegger, Kolakowski, and Badiou notice. You find a similar diagnosis in Kierkegaard, and a certain Schopenhauer, clearly in Marx, then in Lenin. And you even find in a review that Hegel wrote 1826, of a book by a German guy on the, which basically deals with conversion über die Bekehrten. Ernst Raupach is the name of the guy. No one has ever heard of him otherwise. And Hegel there states, indifference is always the worst thing. So that's the worst thing that can happen in difference. So a certain forgetting of difference. Why is the forgetting of difference a problem? Because difference, if we forget difference, that's now, again, Heidegger, we lose a lot of things. Namely, everything that hinges on difference. And one of the things that hinges on difference is meaning, for example. So we lose meaning if we can't distinguish the one thing from another. We lose meaning. And certainly, that's another thing, I'm not going through the entire list, obviously, is for Heidegger freedom, because freedom consists essentially in being able to make a difference. So if we lose difference and the capacity to understand how to make a difference, we also lose our proper understanding of freedom, because we don't understand in any way anymore how to make a difference, and hence we become strangely, if knowing it or not, indifferent. So indifference is the name of the problem. For Heidegger, all of this is an expression, is a symptom of the forgetting of that constitutive difference. And overall, this leads into Heidegger's diagnosis of nihilism. So nihilism is an articulation, a manifestation, an embodiment, a widespread embodiment of a forgetting of difference, and the manifestation, as I said, is therefore indifference. And it gets as bad as the following, that if you tell people that we're living in nihilism, they don't care, because they're indifferent. Right? So that kind of proves the point, but Heidegger wants to suggest with this argument, right, that this indifference that is produced is not a symptom that could be easily articulated, that we could easily just like leave aside and think, okay, then we stop caring. This is for Heidegger, in a certain sense, for the late Heidegger, the limitation of the philosophical analysis of nihilism. Right? No one cares anymore about what philosophers tell you about nihilism. Right? They have become indifferent, and this precisely makes nihilism into nihilism. Right? That you can tell people this is a nihilistic world, and they basically tell you, well, I don't care, just want to watch that movie or stream a series or whatever. Okay. So people, in a certain sense, that's Heidegger's diagnosis, I mean, very abbreviated, as you see, and not overly nuanced, leads to the fact that we misunderstand, that we don't have a proper understanding of what freedom is, because we forgot a constitutive difference, unlearned, as it were, what it is to make a difference, and that is nihilism, and we don't even care that people are telling us that. So quite bad situation overall. Right? Okay. And an expression of this, and right now I'm telling you what I think Heidegger, but also others, are saying what indifference actually means, so they're not caring, or how it manifests. Heidegger says in the seminar on Schelling, what does it mean to become indifferent? To understand freedom as a given capacity. Heidegger literally says that is one of the greatest errors of all time. So if we think freedom is a capacity that we have, this is one of the greatest errors of all time. Because it leads us, I'm just reformulating myself, into a deficient understanding, into a deficient concept of freedom. So we have a crappy concept of freedom if we think that freedom is a capacity that we have. And this is kind of interesting, because even though Heidegger doesn't say what I'm saying right now, because that is a diagnosis that wasn't invented by Heidegger, but that one can find in one of Heidegger's greatest enemies, not Plato, but in Descartes. For Descartes was one of the first who basically said that indifference is a problem, and I'm going to return to that in a second, and it has to do with a certain specific understanding, a deficient understanding of freedom. Okay. Heidegger adds another very curious, I think, element to his description of indifference as a problem. So indifference as a name for the problem of a deficient, problematic understanding of freedom. He namely says, and this is part of the nihilism diagnosis, if we have a crappy understanding of freedom, we take freedom to be a capacity that we just have, we act in a problematic way. Heidegger at one point says, we act worse than animals do. So something strange seems to be happening. Right? We're unable to make a difference, and we take them. In a certain way, we're not unfolding or developing and creating the world, but we're taking it as if it were a stable environment within which we have certain options, and then we interact with them. So the book that precedes this Abolishing Freedom book is called Indifference and Repetition. Right? Okay, it's a pun on Deleuze, obviously, but, and it's a variation on Deleuze because it goes through repeated diagnosis in the history of modern rationalist philosophy that all are articulating that indifference is a problem that has to do with a problematic understanding, with a deficient understanding of what freedom is. The book, very different, and this is why I hope I didn't irritate you too much, is not Heideggerian in its understanding at all, and the whole project is not Heideggerian overall, because it turns around Heidegger's diagnosis. It doesn't assume that part of nihilism and the forgetting of a constitutive difference is actually at the origin of a crappy concept of freedom, but a problematic understanding of freedom that is articulated under the label, in the category, under the name of indifference, is generative of what Heidegger describes as nihilism. If that is an appropriate term, we could talk about this. Okay. So again, what is indifference? Indifference is a way of understanding freedom, where freedom is to be taken, or is taken as a given in the form of a capacity. That is part of that is the crucial thing that I think one can derive from readings from the history of modern rationalist philosophy. So as soon as we take freedom to be always just there, something we're endowed with, as a natural element of us being human beings, there is a problem with this understanding. Okay. And the remedy for all this, and I will slowly progress in this direction, so how do we get out of this problematic understanding? I call that fatalism. And you will see, hopefully see why, but I will tell you a little bit more about the problem and then head in this evil direction. Sartre was one of the people who noticed that indifference has a strange status in the philosophy of Descartes. Descartes, who is usually considered to be the founder of modern philosophy. Because on the one hand side, and I don't know if you know anything about Descartes, but you may know that Descartes is the thinker of doubt, right? So he argued famously that we can doubt pretty much everything except the fact that we're able to do what we're doing when we're doubting, and this leads into certain conclusions. So Sartre thought, okay, doubt is thus the paradigm of freedom for Descartes, and what that means is that when we're doubting things, so I'm doubting what I'm seeing right now, I'm doubting that I can calculate properly, what we're doing in those moments, we're making us indifferent with regard to the things that we're doubting. And Sartre was puzzled that one can find a passage in Descartes where Descartes says precisely the opposite, namely he calls indifference, so what the thing that Sartre precisely thought is the paradigm, the epitome of freedom, the lowest degree of freedom. Right? Descartes literally says indifference is the lowest degree of freedom. And Sartre, he wrote a text called the Cartesian notion of freedom, and in which he basically says, well, Descartes is simply inconsistent. On the one hand side, he says we were making us totally indifferent with regard to all the things that we're not certain about, and on the other hand side, he calls indifference the lowest degree of freedom. Makes no sense whatsoever. Descartes' argument is quite specific, and I think Sartre, there's a solution to Sartre's problem, but I just wanted to say Sartre sees a problem there, and I think there is a solution because Descartes thinks that as soon as we, so let me say why indifference is the lowest degree of freedom, because it believes that freedom is something we just have and we don't exercise. This is basically the assumption. So strangely, in one of the places where Descartes talks about the origin of error and falsity. So this is how Descartes enters this discussion. So at a point where he wants to explain why we commit errors, right? Why we make mistakes, he says, well, the origin of all of our mistakes is indifference. Sounds strange. Why, and can therefore not be the paradigm of doubt, right? Why is that the case? Because when we are indifferent, we already made a mistake. This is Descartes' argument. Why did we already make a mistake? Because we have a problematic conception of freedom. So almost the same argument that I already told you about. What does that mean? Descartes basically argues that freedom, we're more free the more inclined we are. Right? The more we know what the right thing is, the right thing to do, and doing it, the more free we are. So we don't need options. So, right? If you know what the right thing to do is, you don't need another option to be freer, but you're precisely free if you know what the right thing is and you're doing the right thing. This is Descartes' argument. But the moment we believe that we need options, right, nonetheless, we have a problematic understanding of freedom. Why? Because from this understanding results a certain practice of freedom. This is all conceptions and understandings of freedom in Descartes, and that is, in a certain sense, almost an anticipation of Hegel, have practical translations, and the practical translation of understanding freedom as something that we're endowed with and that provides us with, let's say, options of a choice, means that we're trying to realize as much options as possible. So we're not inclined to go for this thing without considering any other options only, and making us, that would be the Descartesian option, indifferent to all other options. Right? So we're not saying, well, I want to marry this woman, but right, we want to keep all our options open. Right? So as if it's constantly Coke Light or Coke Zero all the time, right? And many more Cokes. So, so Descartes' argument is that indifference practically means a kind of crippling of freedom through the multiplication of possibility. Something very strange, a strange problem, but the moment where we insist that freedom is a given capacity, the practice that results from it is that we try to realize possibility, as many possibilities as possible, and never try to just like close down or delimit the ways in which we could act. Descartes also calls this a dream of freedom from which we don't want to awake. And he compares that, so these are quite literary charged, maybe, expressions with people who are lost in the woods and who constantly err around because they think, well, that direction, let's take a left and let's take a right. We don't know what left or right is anymore. Let's just go this way and this way, right? I mean, so a practice of constant revisions. This is what I'm, and not of firm resolve or anything like that, where you're sticking to a certain principle or whatsoever. Okay. So, and Descartes, at one point I'm gonna tell you about this passage, suggests that if we have such an understanding of freedom, there is actually a remedy. There's actually a therapy for getting out of that. And the remedy to that he calls fatalism. The acceptance, the assumption of une certaine fatalité, of a certain fatality, of fate, of a certain destiny. The existence of an already determined fate. Let me give, right now this was all a bit abstract. I'm going to be a bit more concrete. Let me give you a stupid empirical example. Virgin Enterprise, you may have heard of that company, right? What they did, I think 2, 3, 4 years ago, they made it, you find that on their website, it's quite obscene. They basically said that having a prescribed number of vacation days is highly unproductive for their employees. Because the employees should freely decide how much vacation they need. So if you just like, I don't know, contractually regulate that they only have, I don't know, 30 days a year or how much whatsoever, you restrict their freedom. So they should freely decide how much holiday and vacation they need. I'm quoting their website, it's quite nice. Flexible working has revolutionized how, where, and when we do all our jobs. So if working 9 to 5 no longer applies, then why should strict annual leave and vacation policies? So, and you see the implication is when we sometimes have to work from 5 to the other next 5, right, the other day, or just like 24/7, that means we shouldn't take a vacation. You can read it precisely also in that way, right? And effectively what happened after they introduced that kind of policy, the number of taken vacation days dropped lower than ever before. And so it was ingenious, right? Because what kicked in immediately after they said, well, you freely decide how much vacation you need, is the harshest competition among the employees, because of course all that only worked under the condition that you can only take a vacation if the work is done. Right? They didn't say, well, if you don't want to work, don't come. They basically said, well, you can have as much holiday as you like if you do what we expect you to do, or what you think you should do for us. So why am I telling you this? Because this was a kind of practice, a kind of thing implemented in the name of creating more freedom for the employees. Right? So it was an agenda that worked under the signifier, under the label of freedom, creating more freedom. And that is quite in line with what you already find, for example, in Marx's Capital, when Marx states that within the Eden, and he calls that the legal framework on which all capitalist productions, forms of productions rely, famous sentence, there alone rule freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. Right? So it sounds all cool, right? Freedom is great, equality is great, property, but okay. And then Bentham, and as Martin Delare has, I think, brilliantly shown, the last element of the series, so Bentham, over-determines all the others. So there's a very specific twist to what freedom means if Bentham is in the same series of signifiers as that, because Bentham here in the series, in Marx's understanding, stands for something like pure self-calculating or calculating self-interest. So what I'm trying to say with these examples is that the signifier of freedom, and this is connected to what I talked about before under the label of indifference at the problem, can effectively function by producing unfreedom. So certain understandings, especially when they become hegemonic, right? Think of, I don't know, war declarations by George Bush bringing freedom to, right? I mean, just think of examples like that. Can effectively endorse a practice of unfreedom or oppression. And at least also of disorientation, because if you're all for freedom, and it's kind of hard not to be for freedom most of the time, right? It's kind of weird who your allies are, right? George Bush and the Virgin Enterprise people and so forth, right? So there is a problem at that point. So it seems that all this works, this kind of disorientation works, because it relies on the assumption that we already have the freedom that we then start interpreting and distributing and asserting and reorganizing in a certain way. There is a quite nice commentary that Kojève, French philosopher guy, once made when he talked about a specific passage in Hegel's Phenomenology, where Hegel talks about basically slavery and the best form of how to reproduce slavery, which Hegel considers to be Stoicism. And Stoicism is basically the assumption, this is what Kojève suggests, that we're free no matter what the material conditions are. Right? And if you ever want to become a slave owner, make sure that your slaves are Stoics, because then they believe they have an inner freedom totally independent of what the material outer conditions are. Right? And that's totally great, because they have the freedom of thought and whatsoever, and freedom to, I don't know, be with their thoughts wherever they want, even though they are materially not free at all. So the reproduction, this is the Kojève argument, and he calls it the slave ideology of freedom. The reproduction of this problematic or oppressive situation functions even better if the people experience their own unfreedom as freedom. Right? So if you can convince people that they're free, no matter what happens to them, that's totally great, because you can do whatever you want to them. Right? Okay. And this is part of the argument that leads to the whole fatalism discussion, is part of making people believe that is to understand freedom in the lowest possible way, namely as a capacity that we just have and are naturally endowed with. I call that, just to put a label on this, the myth of the givenness of freedom. Right. Okay. And there's I think, kind of nice anecdote that illustrates or illuminates this point quite well. It's the anecdote of Buridan's ass, so not bottom, but the animal, right? Because this animal is quite hungry, super hungry actually, and is in equidistance of two just like beautiful looking heaps of hay, right? But it can't decide to go for which one to go, and it actually dies. Right? Okay, Buridan never wrote that anecdote, but that's another story. But you see that the existence of a choice that is part of this Buridan argument can mortify the actuality of taking the choice, right? So there problems can emerge. So how to get out of such a situation? I think, and this is what Abolishing Freedom does, it returns to a strange, let's say, concatenation, namely that the thinkers, the modern rationalist thinkers that have been identified as the thinkers of freedom, so Descartes, Kant, Hegel, up to a certain extent Freud, but all of them endorse not only a concept of freedom, but at the same time something like divine predestination, a concept of destiny, a concept of fate. So at least in Descartes, Kant, Hegel, one finds the explicit claim repeatedly that one must think something like God's plan, and at the same time they try to think the concept of freedom. And the problem that this book seeks to address is, how do you bring these two things together? How can you, on the one hand side, defend what later Freud will call absolute or utter psychic determinism, and on the other hand side, not give up totally on the concept of freedom, because that could be the immediate consequence or inference. Well, my suggestion, that's the essential suggestion of the book, is because the concept of fate, and this is where I derive fatalism from, right? It's the conceptual necessity for the concept of fate in situations in which a problematic concept of freedom and understanding prevails. This is the short form of it. Has a therapeutic and a strategic effect. So I'm not saying that fatalism gives you a new concept of freedom, or it simply gets rid of all the problems related, but it helps you to get rid of a problematic understanding of freedom. And of course you can see, by shifting the assumption that I always have freedom to the assumption that I don't always have freedom. I mean, it's a very, very trivial move in a certain sense. Because if all things are predestined, or determined, or predetermined in a way, I don't have the freedom to do as I choose. Or the choices are no real choices. Overall, this is an argument for moving from the assumption of a almost always natural givenness of freedom to a theory of the constitution of freedom. So this is the move that I'm trying to make. And the argument is that fatalism, the assumption of fate, the assumption of predetermination, the assumption of something that is out of my hands, is actually allowing to make this transition. To make the transition from the assumption that freedom is always a given, for whatever reasons, to a theory of how freedom is brought about. There are certain similarities of this argument to what Jean-Pierre Dupuy calls enlightened doomsaying. I don't know if you've ever heard of the guy. He's quite an interesting French theorist of catastrophe. So, I mean, if you don't know him, read him. he has a quite wonderful argument. He's trying to argue, for example, that how does will the, for example, ecological catastrophe be brought about? Precisely by our ways of trying to prevent it. So how do we make sure that the environment will be totally screwed? In the very ways in which we're trying to organize our future, wait for the tipping point, calculate with things that we cannot be certain with, and so forth. So our very ways of trying to prevent a problem is the very reason for the problem to arise. So what to do with this? Dupuy suggests that the only thing that we can do, and this is the enlightened doomsaying strategy, is to assume that the catastrophe that we're bringing about is absolutely certain, and it's impossible that it will be ever be avoided. So we invert the perspective. So the catastrophe is nothing we manage or prevent, but we assume it's absolutely certain and it's impossible that we can ever prevent it. And then, from this maybe, there is no certainty, no security on that side, maybe something will allow for an actual prevention of the catastrophe. But we have to start from assuming that there will be no way in which we can prevent the catastrophe. Because all ways we're trying to prevent it are the very ways in which we're bringing it about. That is a good example of fatalism in the way that I'm trying to articulate. Let me give you one, and then I end. Let me give you one example. So, what does it mean to make the move from freedom as a given through fatalism? So an assumption of a certain impossibility to a potential theory of the constitution of freedom. Think of, I don't know, if you're in the mood or if you're in need, think of a situation where you would want to fall in love. How to prepare for something that by definition is quite hard to prepare for, right? Go out into cafes, online dating, I don't know, randomly talking to strangers on the street could get you arrested, I don't know, right? I mean, so how do we do that? The assumption of that kind of fatalism, and that I think one can unravel and develop from someone like Descartes and others, is by assuming that you will never ever fall in love. Never ever. That it's totally impossible. Because what happens in that very move is, previously you think there are possibilities, and it's in part your own action that will constitute the falling in love. Like online dating, have a nice profile, I don't know, pretending you're someone you're not, whatever you do for strategy. You move from letting this assumption that falling in love is part of your own capacity, like you can do it, it's part of what you are able to do. You let this go and assume the actual impossibility of something that is totally incalculable, right? That you cannot anticipate. With that move, you are not simply giving everything up, this is what I'm saying, but you're affirming something that actually has something to do with falling in love. Namely that if you really fall in love, something you would never ever have thought is possible actually happened, right? Something impossible. So it's not a merely negative move. You don't get a theory of freedom yet, but you're making the move from assuming that you're able to do something through the assumption of your own incapacity to a point of impossibility, to something, to the affirmation of something as impossible. And this move, yes, that's what I call fatalism, and that at least abolishes the assumption as much as possible that freedom is something at our disposal and in our possession. I stop here.
Thank you, Frank, very much, and I really have to say that this is a great pleasure to have this opportunity to discuss this with you. And as I told you just before we started, the Slovene translation of the book is even much more programmatic. It's like, let's abolish freedom, and it's the invitation, it's let's abolish freedom with Frankom Rudo and Alenko Zupančič. So we are called today to do something here, which I'm not sure we will be completely able to, but nevertheless, let's at least try. So perhaps, I will just make a few remarks and things that I think perhaps need to be further emphasized or questioned or whatever. And I think it's first just to make this claim valid. Why do we need to abolish freedom? I mean, you've already made or presented some of the important examples, and I think it's really, I mean, to put it in the most banal and obvious terms, we do all know how the very signifier, the reason why you can claim that freedom has turned into a signifier of oppression, with which many very not really pretty things are being done, which had very little to do with freedom. The reason why this happened, among other things, is clearly that the signifier became more and more kind of compressed solely in the direction of the freedom, whatever, of the market, on this kind of, not even liberal in this more general sense, but actually freedom of choice, freedom of market, freedom of choices that are clearly they're in relationship to what we call liberal democracy today. And it's quite obvious that this has some very bizarre, strange effects, where terms like freedom of speech, which at some point when, let's say, less democratic regimes existed, they still exist obviously, but there was a certain glamour, there was a certain risk attached to speaking up, to saying something that could perhaps shatter something. And what we are witnessing today within, let's say, liberal democracy is that this signifier freedom of speech is reinvented mostly as more or less right-wing excuse to insult somebody, to just say, you bitch, and then I have the freedom of speech, you cannot persecute me, this is what I think, this is what I mean, I can be racist, I can insult, this is my freedom, my right to freely speak my mind, let's say. And there are some completely ridiculous examples of this kind of thing. So what is so crucial in your book is precisely how you move obviously beyond this kind of superficial phenomena and start, I think, at absolutely right point, which is this question of the problem that comes with conceiving freedom as a possibility, as a capacity, which is already a certain specific concept of freedom. And as you'll surely remember, when your book came out in English, I've written some kind of comment on it, and I used, I mean, people also know it here, but I will reuse this example because it is at the same time funny and quite useful of how this thinking of freedom and possibility together, how it can, what it actually means. And it's an example from Monty Python's Meaning of Life, the movie. You've probably all seen the movie, you remember, I think it's the first scene when first you see this huge Catholic family. They have like this absurd amount of kids, and they're all singing in this way of a kind of Broadway musical, every sperm is sacred. So they are singing and they are like hundreds of them, literally, all these kids. And then the camera cuts to a Protestant couple observing these bloody Catholics, as they say, across the window. And so the man says to his wife, look, these Catholics, this is because every time they have sexual intercourse, they have children, they have to have a baby. And so the wife looks at him and says, okay, but it's the same with us. We have sexual intercourse twice and we have 2 babies, so it makes sense. And he said, but this is not the point. We could have done it any time we wanted. We could have done it hundreds of times per day. And so it goes on in this direction, you see, and even in the sense of the man is bragging how he could walk down the street, enter some kind of pharmacy and speak out loud saying, I want a condom, and I even want the one which enhances pleasure with some tickling, whatever thing. And the wife goes more and more, but why don't you, in this sense. So you have like, but what I really like about this episode is that it really has 2 levels, and one should not fall into the trap of understanding it too quickly. So one level is obviously this. If you have the possibility to do it, they have the possibility to do it, but they never do it. The possibility is enough, so they are just as even more bored than the whatever, or annoyed than this huge Catholic family. But then I think what this opens up is another kind of a trap, which also I think you talk about in the book. It is precisely this trap of conceiving of freedom in terms of the difference between just the possibility and the realization of this possibility. So you have this, I think the trap, ideological trap to avoid here is to say, okay, but if they were to act upon this possibility and have sex all the time and use this condom, then they would have been free, really. But this is precisely the trap to avoid, because this is clearly the freedom that is the given set of possibilities gives you. There is nothing new that you achieve by acting on it. You just get what you already have. And I think this is precisely why this episode, at least for me, is so funny, because they take this idea of the freedom of choice as possibility quite literally. And they actually, the husband, at least, he has this almost directly saying, but we have the possibility and that should suffice. This is our freedom. So we are free to do it. This is our freedom. It's not then if we do it or not, this is anecdotic, but the freedom is right there, and it's clearly limited precisely by this kind of scope. And so I really think that there is this both thinking of freedom in terms not only of possibility, of capacity, but also then falling immediately into this, basically, as you mentioned, into consumerist trap, where once you have a possibility, you are expected to realize as many possibilities as possible. So the very way of realizing this possibility becomes a way of getting more and more entrapped within the framework which decides what your possibilities are and prevents you from perhaps changing this very set of possibilities or something like this. Okay, so this is why I think it's really important, not only theme, the questioning, it's really important to try to disentangle this dimension or this conception of freedom as capacity, as or also, as you put it, as something simply given. Although here, I think there is, even with fatalism, at some point you come back to something given. I mean, it's the whole task here is precisely to deconstruct these obvious couples here, like active, passive. It's another one. And by the way, you mentioned the passion de l'âme, the passions of the soul, the heart, which is, I think, the very term passion is a very good example here, because you know how it evolved. It's the same in Slovene, we have now another word, but when Descartes used it, it was not at all conceived in the way we conceive passion today as some activity. I mean, today if you say somebody is passionate, it usually means that he or she is driven to act. Whereas there it means actually that you passively receive these sensations. It's like, and in Slovene it was the pečnost ti duše, it was the most kind of better translation, which is precisely, and you have this light and Leidenschaft in German, which is to suffer something as the beginning of the etymological word of passion. So passion itself, and I think it kind of captures the ambiguity that you want to produce through this example of fatalism, the very ambiguity of something which is at the same time free and unfree, or that is active and passive, and which cannot be disentangled in this simple way. Or either we act and do something about it, or we just passively wait for the thing to happen. And so how, even through this, whatever, passive waiting, you activate something, or something gets possibly activated that opens up another, whatever, dimension, interesting thing. So, and I also think the example of Descartes, I really like this, how if one just thinks of freedom as the ability to do whatever one does, how this means that not that you can do, if you can do whatever you want, you are not free, you are lost. Like this example of the forest, I think it's really, you are lost in the forest, it's not. So the question of, okay, the old question, but freedom to do what? Freedom to, so it's also this way of, let's say, concrete thinking of freedom not only as freedom as a condition of possibility of something, but also as perhaps something that is quite contingently decided in certain circumstances and events through what you do or not do, but nevertheless that it only happens there. It's not simply something that by this or that you can already determine. So I also really strongly believe that the freedom has much more to do with things that bind us, that kind of force us to do to choose for us, than with this kind of abstract freedom or abstract capacity just to not be bound precisely by anything, just by so this is complete opposite of freedom. Okay, so perhaps not to go on for too long and to let you respond to at least perhaps some things. One question that keeps coming back to me after reading your book and listening to you today is if we take this advice, this fatalism as a formula, and then the formulations that you provide, and also just the last example of falling in love. And I think I have the impression that there are kind of two things that are intermingled in these examples that you do. Namely, one is it just that we need to be to accept that things are somehow already decided or have already happened or whatever is the formula? But then there is this question of the doom or expecting the worst, which is not exactly, it gives a certain color into it. If you say, okay, whatever I do, it's already decided. But if you say expect the worst, then this introduces something slightly differently. It's and I'm not sure whether to think of this in terms of some kind of psychological remedy. You expect the worst and you will never be disappointed because it can only get better. Or is it something that is more like for you conceptual, fundamental, ontological, if you want, in the sense of it's not related to any kind of psychology, but nevertheless the fatalism is not simply about things already being predetermined or necessary in a way, but that this the presupposition of something that the worst will happen, not only that they will happen as they will, but that is plays what is exactly the role in perhaps I will stop now and then.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I can best say something about the last question first, by again saying something about this Buridan's ass example, right? Mm-hmm. Because it seems the ass has two options, like this this hay or this hay, right? That seems to be the two options. But there's actually a third option involved, and the ass actually chooses the third option. I mean, not to go for any of the options, right? So to refuse the choice altogether, in a way. If it makes sense that freedom, in a stronger sense, must have something to do, not precisely as I think also emphasized, not with accepting given options, but with the constitution of the very framework of the options. And this is where right, the Buridan's ass decision takes place. Then the question is how to conceive of that kind of constitution of the. I mean, Hegel calls that positing of presuppositions, right? So, what is this possibility of constituting the framework in which I choose? The argument I'm trying to make is it would be wrong again to basically say this. Well, this is freedom, right? It's just a given. It's a capacity. We can just alter. Let's just alter the framework. But what I'm trying to say is, and this is why I absolutely agree with. I think this is better than I started with with the description that this constitution must have something to do with an indistinction of activity, passivity, and so forth. So something must potentially happen for me to be able to affirm that which happens as occasion for the constitution of a new framework of possibilities. Right? I need something like an external trigger, which only exists as an external trigger when I follow on it. Right? I mean, just like, again, the falling in love example. Something needs to happen to me so I can afterwards call him or her. Right? I mean, and this means there is, if I don't call, right, not much happens afterwards. So, and in a sense, I mean, Lacan has this nice saying, so it goes also for other things than love, right? I mean, Lacan has this nice saying where he says, ne devient fou qui veut, right? I mean, not everyone who wants is getting mad, becomes mad, right? So we can't decide if we want to be insane or not. So something, right? And this also the madness of love seems to have to do with this, let's say, with this indistinction. Something needs to happen which allows me, which is the possibility for which creates the possibility for me to reframe the framework of possibilities. How does one prepare for that? I mean, this is the question, and this is where I think this formula of the worst happens, because I want to say the best preparation for it is to expect that it won't happen. Right? I mean, because how would you why is that a preparation? Because thereby, and this is what I tried to say at the end, and maybe that wasn't specific enough, but because thereby I don't simply say, well, I can't make myself fall in love, but I affirm something about the very form, the modality in which the emergence of that very possibility upon which I might act and unfold a new framework of possibilities. I say something about this very, very modality. I mean, I say that it is the impossible qua impossible happening. So it must be something impossible. Otherwise, it would be a possibility. So already within the framework, within the constituted framework of possibilities, right? So, and if I'm correct in assuming that this different kind of non-capacity, freedom must have something to do, or does have something to do, with a reframing of the realm of the possible, then this cannot be part of the realm of the possible. It cannot be one of the possibilities between which I choose. So it must be something that within that framework can only appear as impossible.
Okay.
Please.
No, because I think it's perhaps there's one thing in this example, or repeating of the example that you now provided, the relationship to love. You say, because I think there are two levels, and then you just introduced the term contingency, which is obviously necessary would be like part of this. Something contingently happens to you, like from whatever, and this is what introduces the necessity. It's not that this kind of, it is what introduces the necessity for you to act this way and so the necessity itself is brought about by this kind of contingency. But then for me, and I think this is also perhaps the debate that we to some extent already had when the book first came out, is, okay, there is this question of acting as if, but I think it could be formulated precisely in this context, namely, what if I cannot, like, I'm this stupid woman who still hopes to fall in love. So what do I do to act as if this is impossible? It's not obvious. I think perhaps you already need a contingency or something that happens to you here to actually be in this state of mind where you can say, okay, this is that. I mean, it's not so easy to, I mean, it's so easy, obviously it's not so easy, but there is a problem already on that level of how to assume for real, not just like I will pretend, but like do you really, really believe that you're doomed? Just really believe. Because I think even though we keep hearing all these kind of catastrophe scenarios every day today, but I don't think we seriously believe that they are doomed. So what to do to perhaps, it's not even in the perhaps there is some kind of things that should happen there, not simply, and then of course the contingency that will, and this is perhaps already the solving of the problem. You don't need, I mean, so it kind of transposes the question from one level to another. But anyway, I think
well, I think I only have I have two so-so answers. So not I don't think two so-so answers make one good answer. But I'm going to give you the two so-so answers. So in a certain way, one could say the problem is, how do I act upon what I take to be true? How do I believe what I know?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, how do I practically translate what I think that I know? And I think in your reply, it is connected to the act as if formula, because I mean this is a formula which is very problematic in Kant, right?
Yeah.
And one can, I mean, I think you in your reply you gave the Italo Svevo novel Zeno's Conscience an example. So someone wants to stop smoking. How does he or she do it? Does it help if he or she already acts as if he already stopped? Right? And obviously, well, if he or she manages to do that, that's great, right? But that's the sort of circumvents the whole problem. That's obvious. Yes. And so at that point, and that's the first so-so answer, I think there is a distinction between possible as-ifs and non-possible as-ifs, and all the non-possible, all the I want all the, and I don't know if I'm consistent, but I want all the as-ifs in that book to be strongly impossible. Strongly impossible as, well, the whole book begins with a discussion of a debate between Erasmus of Rotterdam and Luther about if there is free will or not. So, and basically the gist of what there is about the status of belief. Can we just start believing? Are we free to believe whenever we want? I mean, can we just start to believe in God? Because we think it's, I don't know, strategically the best option or whatever, or how do we get into belief? And Luther criticizes Erasmus for basically believing that. We can't just read the Bible and then start believing because it's a good story and he or she, or it seems to be kind of good God and supportive and all that. And Luther strictly insists that there must be something like an event of faith, right? Something needs to be happening to me. And how do I prepare for an event of faith? Right? I mean, that is kind of what he brings up. And he has a kind of interesting example. He basically says, well, I must imagine that I am only really alive when I believe in God. But I don't have the capacity to start that kind of belief. So what do? I imagine not to be alive. But I imagine that I'm in a status before the creation of mankind. Can one just, I mean, what's the status of that kind of thought experiment? Why I am bringing that up is because it seems to be making a point about something that's utterly impossible, right? And this is the precise status that Luther, and so in a sense Luther plays a role for the whole argument that follows from it. That has to do with the precise status that for Luther have the divine commandments. Because the divine commandments are not just like commandments that we could follow. But Luther believes God only gave us the divine commandments to make us feel, to make us sense how crappy we are, how incapable we are, to make us aware how impossible it is for us to be free. Right? To generate despair, and this kind of despair, or anxiety basically, is then something that can be transformative, not automatically. So that's the first so-so answer. The second is, it's an as-if doing something impossible. That's the short version. The second is, there is another kind of as-if than the Kantian one. And this appears, I think, at the very end of Hegel's phenomenology. Because at the very end of the phenomenology, Hegel says, well, after the whole development that spirit undergoes, and I think I found it, have that somewhere here, it acts as if all that predated it were lost, and it had learned nothing. Right? So at the very end, there is an as if everything that it had learned is not something it would ever have in a possession, but it accommodates a loss, right? A loss of all the presuppositions it had made, of all the self-understandings, of all the things. So it is a moment of, one could say, of anxiety, right? That's the pathway of despair, the climax. This is in absolute knowing. So it's the climax of despair in a certain sense is to act as if this was all for nothing, and one doesn't have any insight to stick to, right? I think that's the same argument, so argument from another side. Does that help?
I think it helps. For me at least, the first way in which you kind of argued for this, does it go in the direction of simply assuming of taking the as if as actually a material pretense, like in this famous formula, act if you have faith and the faith will come. So just join all the symbolic rituals, pretend that you are miserable and you will be miserable, let's say like this, or that you pretend that you are, so that in the sense that if you're just involved in like material practices and rituals that are associated with this kind of state of mind, you will actually become of this state of mind. Because obviously this has both, you can pretend and you can even think that you have some kind of a distance or control over what this is just a pretense, but then obviously always at some point the table switch and you're more into it than you ever thought. So would it be in this sense that like following certain material practices that simply in this sense you will be sure to let's say achieve this kind of state in which you are precisely prepared for the act of faith without by giving up all preparation or something like that.
Well, in a sense, and maybe I add answer onto answer, but the question is, each chapter of the book ends with such a formula, right, in which I resume what the chapter. So it's actually just like let's say a slogan-like summary of the whole book. And why I do this is because I on the one hand side, because I take these slogans to actually be practically quite impossible to follow, right? Because what does it mean to act as if you're dead?
Lie in the coffin.
Yes. Yeah, well, that would be a very weird kind of. But you see what? And this is why let's say the as ifs I enumerate are not, let's say, ethical suggestions or ethical principles, but I take the cue. This forest situation. Right? What does one do? Descartes basically says, well, if we just have to pick a certain line, right? We have to provide ourselves with principles of with some kind of principles of orientation, even if we're totally lost. And Descartes basically, and this is part of him saying, well, I doubt all kinds of things, and on the path to finding a real certainty, something which I can really rely on because it provides me with a real and convincing principle of orientation, I need something to make this transition, and he calls that morale par provision, so provisory morals. So so it's not an ethical framework, but it's highly provisory. Maybe they get all debunked. For him, it's two conservative ones, one creative. So just like I always follow the customs of the country I'm living in. I don't know if that helps a lot, but so. I'm kind of mimicking this, so basically saying these are provisory orientational guidelines that are, as should become clear, highly unpractical. And my point is, because they are trying to emphasize that the kind of practice one is indulging in spontaneously is problematic.
No, I mean, this is clearly also my kind of. So I will leave this be, and there can be some more discussion afterwards. I would just like perhaps just one more thing to come back to the beginning of your talk, because I think it's also important this starting out from the question of difference and indifference. And okay, you said you turned around this Heideggerian diagnosis and how precisely the way we use the concept of freedom is guilty of producing this kind of indifference or differences that make no difference, if any. And here also, I think I would just try to make an example that I also like to use, because I think it's really crucial also to see how this difference that makes a difference nevertheless remains operative, let's say, under the surface or within these differences that make no difference. But and precisely how this move, and I will give an example, how this move to simply, this is all just one plane, we are just looking at differences that don't really matter, how this actually is precisely a way of obfuscating some really problematic, let's say, things like the very opposite of freedom that continue to go on. And this is again, I'm a sucker for jokes, so it's a joke that I will use, and I think I've already used it at some point, about the apartheid regime in South Africa. And you have this scene where there were still times of the segregation, so you had like blacks in the back of the bus and white people in the front. And then a fight starts in the bus, and the chauffeur, the conductor, stops the bus and kind of aligns everybody in front of the bus, starting to preach them, okay, now stop this fight. For me, there are no blacks and whites, you are all green. But now those of the lighter shade of green, please enter the bus in front, and those of the darker shade of green behind. And I think this is precisely sometimes what happens very often, the difference that makes a difference is very much still operative, but we have no means of grabbing it or tackling with it or of even naming it very often. And this, I think, it's a very, very like a totalitarian effect of this kind of democratic notion of freedom as just freedom of possibilities, or precisely which is involved in this kind of reducing of levels to what seems a very democratic, and this is why I like this job, because basically, of course, we should say there are no blacks and whites, we are all green, but nevertheless, it is not enough just to say it like this if the practice, I mean, the thing goes on. So it's under the banner of this democratic acceptance of everything as being on the same level, many of these exclusions and differences are being produced and reproduced incessantly. And I think this is why I think it's very important to bring in this question that you started with of difference and indifference, and of indifference precisely something that is related to the way in which there is this difference that makes a difference. And then also what is, this would be perhaps also my question also, because we have at least superficially this idea of relating somehow fatalism to indifference. That it's something that makes you indifferent to, but clearly what you're doing here is rather the opposite.
Well, I think that is, well, I mean, my one implication of what I'm trying to do here and in this other book too is, there is, Antonio Negri wrote a book on Descartes, and it's called Descartes and the Beginning of the Bourgeois Project, something like that. And he basically says, well, Descartes' philosophy, and it's basically a historical materialist attempt to basically say, well, Descartes was a bourgeois, and what is all that doubt about? It's basically the first crisis of the bourgeoisie. It had to reframe, right, its entire political sort of understanding, and Descartes brings that to light, right? So that is, and I think that there is something deeply flawed in this. I mean, I'm presenting it in a more shitty way, obviously, than he does, but I think there's something deeply flawed in this, or with this, because I think that the problem but nonetheless, one can use one, let's say, element of Negri's, or one component of Negri's reading of Descartes, because that Descartes is, I think, not only the founder of modern philosophy and so forth, but the first to notice that freedom in the form of indifference can actually lead to unfreedom. Seems to have something to do with the bourgeois project, actually, right? I mean, so with a certain kind of economic regime which then becomes prevalent. And this regime seems to rely on a strong indifferentiation of all kinds of things, right? In a certain form, I mean the commodity form. Now, on the one hand side, I totally agree with you. This only functions if there is an underlying difference, namely of those who have certain, let's say, capacities and possessions to distribute and organize this whole system, and others haven't. There's another operation of difference, because I mean the immediate temptation could be, well, if this system produces indifference, relies on indifferentiation or on indifference. And there's a German guy, Georg Lohmann, who wrote a book on Marx, which is called Indifference and Society. And it's basically a reading of Capital that tries to show that Marx offers the most gigantic theory of indifferentiation everywhere, because this is what everything is of equal value, right? I mean, everything is comparable and so forth. And this Lohmann has the idea that against that one needs to emphasize difference. But the problem is not only does this only operate on the basis of the very difference you're describing, but if you're just emphasizing difference against this indifferentiation, this difference can very easily be absorbed into this process of indifferentiation without making any kind of difference, right? With regard to the underlying difference of the distribution of property, for example. So what I'm trying to do, and this is why I totally agree with what you said, fatalism is rather associated also with indifference, and I want to split the concept of indifference into two. So I want to mimic Heidegger talks of an ontic ontological difference, right? So the difference between the ontic sphere of beings and the difference on the other side, the sphere of being, Dasein as such. I want to say there is an ontic ontological indifference that one needs to think. So a different kind of indifferentiation than the one that is predominant, that produces all the diagnosis. And this has to do with fatalism. That up to a certain moment, I mean, it's quite interesting. Maybe this is just a brief anecdote, but in the Passions of the Soul, Descartes basically says, well, there are two really problematic passions that the soul can suffer, which totally disorient it. And one is hope, and the other is fear. They're just like inverted affects. Because, well, what I fear is precisely what I don't hope for. And why is hope and fear problematic? Because I hope for the things that are not in my control. Right? So, and they totally depend on the future. So, right, I mean, if I want to win the lottery, I'm just bet, and then it's totally out of my hands. So, and his argument is basically, why in such a moment, and this is actually almost a therapeutical suggestion, does it help to believe in divine predestination and in fate? Because I realize that only the things that actually depend on me, because predestination granted them on me, actually depend on me, and I don't hope for externally caused things that are totally out of my hand. Right? So I buy, in a certain way, by belief, I have nothing to hope for, and Descartes' argument is then, if I act in this way, that I only rely on the things that totally depend from me, because they have been granted to me by divine predestination, and then the whole question is, what does that mean? But the therapeutic effect is, I have nothing to hope for and I have nothing to fear. So his argument, I will have no regrets, right? Because I know certain things I couldn't change anyhow. And I think this is quite an interesting, almost therapeutical, practical advice, right? I mean, it's not like you're, again, cheesy example, falling in love, and then you think, well, it really went bad, I should not have done it, or something like that, right? I mean, it excludes the kind of revisionism that keeps looking for other possibilities.
I have an immediate question to what you were just saying, Frank. And I'm not sure if you wanted to open this to the general discussion. But I just want to jump directly into what you were saying towards the end and come back to the question of love. My impression is, and I really appreciate how you discuss all the paradoxes of both fatalism and freedom. I really thought this was quite lovely. But for me, I think the most interesting example still was the question of love. And how it is impossible to use your book as a kind of a self-help guide. Okay, I simply have to believe that I will never get a girlfriend, and then maybe I will get it, right? I mean, this doesn't work that way. So in what way then I have to expect the worst? And my impression is, and I want you to tell me if this is a correct impression, but my impression is that you do have to assume a kind of an entity or a kind of a non-entity, maybe like the being itself, which is not an entity or whatever, which is indifferent to me. So some kind of something exterior to me, is some sort of instance which is beyond my control, which is completely out of my hands. So I do have to use that kind of thing. And this is where I come to the example of love, and maybe this would be something that I want to hear your comment on it, which is from Les Liaisons Dangereuses. Towards the end, Valmont gets in love with Michelle Pfeiffer, but he doesn't. I mean, this is what happens, right?
Okay, bring myself into the Michelle Pfeiffer mood.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm more familiar apparently with the film version. Anyway, Vicomte gets in love with Michelle Pfeiffer, but he doesn't know it yet himself. The evil, whatever she is, Duchess, let's say, I don't know what her function is. The evil Duchess...
Marquise de Marquise.
Okay. Marquise knows that he's in love, so she demands that he proves his freedom and independence by telling her, that it's out of his hands. That it's basically, it's out of his hands. And it's only through him proving that he's free, basically. It is only through him declaring that it is actually out of his hands that he realizes that he actually did fall in love with her. So would that be maybe an example that could be pertinent to how you would see?
So the assumption that it is out of my hands to even know when I'm in love.
Yeah, he didn't even know it. Yes, I mean she knew it, but Marquise knew it.
If I can jump in, this novel is one of my favorite topics, and I think the way I read this scene,
right.
You described it rightly that he at that point he has this pact with Marquise de Marquise, right. And he's not supposed to fall in love. This is right. He's falling out of their ethical commitment, the whatever pact that he has with Marquise, and he's kind of failing this pact because he's actually falling in love with Touvel. And what happens here, at least this is why the famous letter that he sends then to Touvel, and which breaks her heart and makes him, as you say, realize that he was perhaps in love, was actually written by Marquise. He just copies it.
Yeah.
And it has this famous line, "It's beyond my control."
Yeah, beyond my control.
It's beyond my control. This is the movie, Ainsi va le monde, I think it's the French. So, but it's, the way I see it, it's precisely because there is a certain mockery. For me, this is, and it's meant to be, as Marquise puts it herself, it's meant to be a sword with which she, with Valmont's hand, kind of steps Touvel, Michelle Pfeiffer, which precisely with this wording, which is a mockery of whatever idea of love one may have at that 18th century, and which is of course already predicated on this other presupposition that comes in of this l'homme machine, etc. The same. So, but it's a wording which is really interesting because it has this ce n'est pas ma faute, yeah, it's beyond my control, but which is not what he's. I mean, she makes him say this to another woman, knowing that this will be the worst offense. That all this passion, all this life that Tourville thinks she's having with this man is actually so easily. I mean, this is at least. So I'm not so even sure, but it's interesting. The question is good because it's interesting how the fate is used here as a kind of complete, as a weapon in the sense of kind of mockery of whatever passion that they are feeling, and it's a kind of a clear indication that he doesn't give a damn. I mean, it's just like saying, this is how it is.
But it's, I mean, this is my reading, that it's through him saying that he doesn't care that he, discovers that he actually does. I mean, before he says it, he really believes that he's indifferent to her.
I think it's through the consequences, because the consequences are that these things fall apart. And the thing, I mean, he loses her through this thing. So, and through losing her, I think he really realizes, that he has been in love, and that it's much more, that he suffers much more than, and this is why then he even tries to make it work again and invent some other thing, but it's clearly on the way. I mean, but it's the perfect missile that this other woman finds to injure her competition, whatever. It's precisely this fatalist, whatever formula. Ce n'est pas ma faute. It's not. This is how.
I mean, the way I see it connected to Frank's point, and I might be completely wrong, is that that you do have to assume this kind of a missile or a knife of destiny in a way. I mean, of course. This marquise is not destiny as such, but she is using the language of destiny, right? It's beyond my control, it's out of my hands, whatever. So what I'm suggesting, I suppose, is that, this is a question though, I'm asking whether, do you think it's necessary to assume this kind of otherness in your line of argument?
So that there are some
in Luther, I think it's pretty obvious that you do have to assume this kind of otherness, right? That you have to assume a kind of divine presence.
Well, I mean, in Luther, it's absolutely, for me, it's absolutely mind-blowing, the argument that he unfolds. Because, right, I mean, he is annoyed by the assumption that we could secure our salvational status through good deeds, right? I mean, so we could do good deeds, and then we assume because God is like us, right? He or she or it will just like have a catalog of all the stuff we have done, and at one point he will say, well, okay, clearly this is heaven, or something like that, right? And Luther basically says, and this is almost there was this guy who died too early. What's his name again? Rainer Schürmann, who basically said what Luther's argument is almost Heidegger, first Kant and then Heidegger in Nietzsche, because what Luther then does, he first affirms the absolute difference between God and human beings, right? He says, well, we should never apply our own norms or reflections or whatsoever onto God. That is blasphemy, right? I mean, God is not one of us; it's God. And God revealed us to us in a certain way, but even revealed God is not identical to God in itself, right? So this difference is one which, by means of which, we ensure two things. That we realize that the difference between God and us is a difference that's different from all other differences. So it's not like stone, rose, another human being, and then God, right? It's something totally different. That we're totally incapable of ever knowing anything. It's just like in the Johnny Cash song, like The Man Who Comes Around. I mean, that is the God. He or she or it could just like randomly or evilly decide, well, I don't know, don't like him or her, right? I mean, we don't know. And then, and I hope this might be an answer. And then there is something absolutely interesting, fundamentally different from in Luther from Calvinism, namely the absolute prohibition to speculate. And this is, I think, absolutely crucial, because as soon as you have the prohibition, as you don't have the prohibition to speculate what God's plan is, right? You start looking for signs, and you start economizing. You basically, right, I don't know, I won the lottery, I have a great partner, I have a Porsche, well, God must like me, or something like that, right? And so you start attempt to accumulate all these signs, or what you take to be signs. And this is actually, if you read the Protestant Ethics, the Max Weber book, this is actually what Weber also sees, that Calvinism is actually the problematic version. But Luther prohibits that. So there's no way in which we could speculate about what God wants with us. Why am I saying that? Because that means we should be indifferent with regard to God. This is the absolute paradox and beauty of Luther's argument, right? We need to assume there is a difference, there is a God that is so different from us that we will never be able to conceive of him or her or it, so we should not. Right? And this is actually part of the basis of actual belief. And this, so to not speculate about his or her plans. And nonetheless assume that he or she or it has these plans. Right? So a quite difficult thing to do. Yeah.
So, more questions? This is the time to ask them.
We started talking about love, and then I was reminded of slavery and of Toni Morrison's book Beloved, where Sethi kills her children when she finds out that they will be taken into slavery. And it was based on the real-time event where Michelle Garner, who was then imprisoned, was asked, and she said that if she had the chance, she would do it again. So I was thinking about, was that an example of like utter desperation, or was it she free in that moment when she decided to kill her children out of love so they would not continue living in slavery?
So the perspective is slavery and to prevent
Yes.
going into slavery. I wouldn't call that fatalism. I don't think necessarily that is. Let's put it like that. The condition seems to be quite different, right? Because I mean, and this is why it's kind of important. I think I only said that in passing. That what I try to bring out is a diagnosis and problematization and potential, let's say, remedy for very specific situations, right? So I don't think this is, I mean, if you have actual slavery, you could basically say, well, freedom is a signifier of oppression. I mean, unless you have stoicism, right? I mean, but that, I wouldn't overgeneralize that. So I would emphasize that this argument works if there is an understanding of freedom in that very sense. And well, if you're facing actual slavery, I don't immediately think that your problem is a problematic understanding of freedom. Right? I mean, the problem then might just be slavery. Right? You see what I'm saying? Yeah.
All right. You have further questions?
Yeah, I have actually one longer question and one bit shorter one. So the first one is, when you're talking about action, you present the next dialectic. So on the one hand, we have a theory that says freedom is given. On the other hand, we have fatalism. And my question is, doesn't exist a position beyond those two ones, in which we conceive an action as something that is free only retroactively? So we have a subject that acts, we don't have a subject that says, I'm going to do this or that, and then does this or that, and then there's a problem, was this free or not? But we have a subject that acts, that is in itself an action, and then this action is only retroactively thought as free. So this is on theoretical level. And on the practical one, when you say that if we think fatalism, that we kind of surpass the position of freedom as given, but my trivial question would be, don't we actually can we actually think freedom, but just by redefining the notion of choice? So you say, okay, today we have this paradigm of choice. Freedom of choice is whether I buy, like, I don't know, this shirt or the other shirt. But the real notion of choice is something that surpasses the, so to say, structural determination of our society. So the real choice would be, I don't know, what is my political stance, what science do I pursue, or something like it. So this would just be the first question. On the one side, the theoretical point about freedom as retroactive notion, and on the other side, practical, my practical problem with the notion of choice, so that we can actually surpass the dialectic between freedom is given and determinism just by redefining the notion of choice in slightly different way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with regard to the first, I think I agree, and this, but I think this would be. I would happily accommodate this within this framework. Of course, I think there's this Adorno example Adorno gives when he returns to Germany, and he talks to a guy called Schlabendorf, who was in the resistance against fascism, and he basically Adorno basically asked him, how could you do that? I mean, how you were totally aware that if they catch you, they would kill you. How were you able to decide to do this, to choose that fate? And Schlabendorf basically answered, well, I was compelled, I had no choice. I had to do this. And Adorno takes this as, I mean, in German it's das Hinzutreten, a supplement, something which inclines you. And this is why I briefly referred to Descartes basically saying freedom insists in being compelled to do something. But retroactively, you can experience this totally, this kind of compulsion as a free act. So I'm not right. I mean, just to be clear, I'm not saying fatalism just offers us a transition into a better realm of choices, right? But I'm saying fatalism enables to conceive that freedom might have something to do with being compelled to do something, right? Here I stand, and I can do no other, as Luther famously said. So this kind of compulsion to do something might be closer to freedom than the freedom of choice. And fatalism, this is the gap I'm trying to bridge there. And the second one, maybe just very quickly, there is a interesting pupil of Kant's who I think. He's called, I talk about him in the book briefly, he's called Carl Christian Erhard Schmidt, or as Mandola once said, the good Carl Schmidt, which I still like. And he coined a term and he was a dedicated Kantian, and he coined a term which he called intelligible fatalism. And intelligible fatalism comes, and hopefully that is an answer. It springs from one very simple idea, namely that Kant seems to distinguish in Schmidt's reading two realms: the realm of freedom and the realm of necessity, or of natural necessity and natural causation. And Schmidt basically raises the question: if this distribution works, then it makes no sense to say that freedom consists in me choosing if I want to act freely or if I want to act according to natural causality, right? So freedom cannot be the meta capacity to choose if I want to act freely or if I want to act in a naturally caused way. But what does that mean? It is out of my hands. So there is no choice, right? So either I act freely or I act by natural causation, but it's out of my hands in a way, right? So in this sense, this suspends or eliminates choice, but it introduces a different type of determinism. This is what I'm trying to say. So it's not the natural determinism, right? It's neither that I have the free choice. So none of the two sides repeats on that higher level. It's neither my free choice, nor am I just naturally determined to act freely or non-freely, but it's a different kind of determinism, and he calls that determinism intelligible fatalism. So, I mean, and for him it's a name for contingency in a way. I mean,
what about, I mean,
Yeah.
both in relation to what you just said and to the question, what about, okay, to introduce this heavy notion, but nevertheless this Kantian idea of the transcendental choice of character, which is precisely a different kind of choice. It's not a new set of choices. It's this idea that although you are completely determined by your character, what your nature, so to say, but on some level, and this is the presupposition, the only point where you can find freedom. It's not any, for Kant in this sense, direct thing, but precisely this presupposition that at some level, not consciously, not in any kind of now I choose this or that, you have chosen your transcendental character, and then you can read this, at least if you force Kant a little bit, also in this sense that you were suggesting that it is only retroactively from your actions that you can actually deduce what have you chosen, and what is, okay, not so much if you're free or not, but precisely what, in a way, yes, in the sense, can you really act morally? You can not in advance. I mean, this is the eternal problem with Kant, because normally we should determine everything in advance and say, and now then there is the eternal problem that no action at all is ever capable of living up to this standard. But then you can also switch this the other way around and say it is only from retroactively from actions themselves that you get to deduce your transcendental character.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think Schmidt overemphasizes, nonetheless, the determinist side in basically saying, right? I mean, there is neither natural determination nor simply free acts when we have to decide if we want to act according to one or the other. But there is something is determining us. But you're right. I mean, there must be a choice. What Freud calls choice of neurosis.
Yeah,
right? I mean, choice of neurosis is also
that you can actually somehow repeat this choice, make a different choice, but again, not in this kind of a meditative way. So saying, okay, now I will choose now to something completely different, to use another Monty Python line. But it happens in another way. But nevertheless, it changes something that makes you do certain things and not others. So to say. Changes your necessities.
Yes. No, I agree.
So time is kind of running out. So if you wanted to ask a question, you better do it now.
I just had one simple question. Those are the worst.
Yeah. Pure horror. Yeah.
It's about your use of the word therapeutic. What exactly is therapeutic? Because you used it several times now in talk. You also have in the book, like how to conceive the therapeutic value of fatalism. Is it to be conceived against what in analytical philosophy is called the ontological commitment, which means I'm proposing this as a sort of theoretical means, but I'm not making an ontological commitment that there actually is fate, determinism, whatever. So, are you posing it in this kind of opposition, or is it that what you are trying to do, the whole strategy, actually to undo this kind of opposition?
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah, yes. Well, I'm trying to undo this opposition because, and this has to do. Well, I fear if I'm saying what I will be saying, I'm making things worse. But what else?
They can't get any worse.
That is coming.
No, they always can.
So. In a certain way, I think, well, maybe the better term that I sometimes use was a strategic use of fatalism, and strategic in both senses of therapeutic different ontological commitment, if you wish. And I'm trying to say that in this way because what is quite crucial for this whole thing is, and so if my diagnosis is problematic, or if you find the diagnosis problematic, a lot of things hang on this. Namely, that this is an attempt to conceive of preparation, and this is, I think, one of the terms I almost overused in the book, of preparation for something you can't prepare for. The background of this is our diagnosis, let's say diagnosis of the present conjuncture that reach from Badiou's suggestion that we're living in an intermediary time, right? Something collapsed and no new orientations emerge. And Badiou himself returned to Descartes and basically tried to revamp the morale par provision. To Wolfgang Streeck, who basically suggests something very similar to the old Gramsci claim, right? The old is dying, the new hasn't been born, or right, cannot be born. So this kind of stuckness, what to do in this intermediary spaces where, and this is why I emphasized before that it is a provisory morality and not an ethical proposal. So in this sense, I'm using these transitory elements from the history of modern rationalism to basically say, well, it of course has ontological implications, I wouldn't be denying that, but these are for the time being, so I'm not formulating an ontology of fate, but I'm using, my question is, what does philosophy do in a time in which its tasks seem to be to help for the preparation for something for which one cannot prepare? Or doesn't it have any kind of function? And so the short answer is yes, it can propose a morale par provision, which on the one hand side is strategic, but has ontological, does come with a strategic ontology, if you wish. This was also is also resonant of my previous answer that, let's say, if you're living in the Handmaid's Tale society, it would be weird to endorse this kind of argument. This is why it is I think conjunctural, but conjunctural in the sense that this conjuncture has happened before in the history of philosophy. I hope that is the answer.
All right, we'll have to hope that that's an answer because we are running out of time. Against all hope, we'll have to hope. So thank you all for coming tonight. Before we thank Alenka and Frank, let me just invite you one more time to get your own copy of a book at a special discount price, and then you can bugger old Frank here to give you a signature in your personal copy of the book, which would be a fantastic thing to do. Stick around with Maska, stick around with Nova Pošta. And yes, thank you everyone for watching us over Facebook. I see there's a lot of people actually watching. Hi. We should say hi to them. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's thank properly Alenko Zupančič and Frankom Rudo.